Hello, it's Miss Bell again. So for this unit, we're going to be talking about evolution. So before we get started talking about evolution, I first wanted to kind of let you guys know that we're going to be talking about various theories on evolution. Many of these theories have been disproven at some point, but remember they are theories. This is just what different scientists believe. And so a lot of the theories are going to conflict with each other. So, I'm not teaching you what to believe. I'm teaching you this scientist believes in this and this scientist believes in that, so that you can have an understanding of what these different scientists believed in, what their experiments were. Some of their experiments we're going to talk about aren't even really valid experiments with what we know science to be like today. So anyway, just keep this in the back of your mind as we're going over all of this stuff. Okay, so first off, Charles Darwin is basically considered the father of evolution. And he's considered the father of evolution because he came up with one of the main ideas of evolution that we can see come into play in different populations right now. Just every day you can see this. And anyway, so that theory of evolution is based on what we call natural selection, which is, if you've ever heard of survival of the fittest. It's basically nature selecting who is best fit for that environment. Whoever is best fit for the environment, they survive. If you survive, you get to reproduce and pass on your genes to your offspring. If you don't survive, well, you're not going to pass your genes on because you're dead. So, and this applies to populations, different species. So anyway, Charles Darwin, when he did all his research on the theory of evolution and natural selection, it was shaped by different other scientists. Several other scientists. There were many people that came before him that did different experiments to prove and disprove different things. And sometimes it takes watching someone do something incorrectly to figure out the correct way to do it. And so that's kind of what happened with Darwin. But he did do a ton of research, and we're going to talk about that when we get to Darwin. So this particular PowerPoint that we're going over is focused on, yes, some of the theories of evolution, but this specific PowerPoint is focused on people. Okay, so all of the scientists we're going to talk about, you need to know what they did. So you will have them on your test. This is multiple objectives for your state test. So anytime we talk about a person, we need to know what they did. Anyway, so the first person we're going to talk about is, and you have to just bear with me because I'm not the best at pronouncing all these foreign names, but it's Leclerc. So you need to focus mainly on the last names here. So anyway, this was in the 1700s when he lived. He made a 46-volume encyclopedia called History Naturelle. And so what he discussed and what he did was in his encyclopedia that he made, he talked about different sources of variation and relationships among organisms. So he talked about, okay, well, this is a source of this species variation, and he noticed that this species is similar to this other species. He also identified similarities between apes and humans. And he considered a common ancestry. You're going to hear that a lot when we talk about evolution, is common ancestor. So your ancestry is your history of ancestors. So if you and I came from the same ancestor, then maybe we had the same grandparents or great-grandparents. At some point, we came from a similar ancestor. It could be great-grandparents. It could go back, hundreds of generations or 3 generations. So that is what a common ancestor is. So one of the things we talk about a lot in evolution was if it came from a common ancestor. So he said that apes and humans possibly came from a common ancestor because of the similarities, like the thumbs, the opposable thumbs, and some other things. But anyway, he thought the environment directly acted on organisms based on organic particles. Okay, so he thought there were actually particles in the environment that acted on different organisms to cause them to evolve. He also published this other thing called Les Epoques de la Nature. And so this was he was the first person to challenge the religious belief that planet Earth is only 6,000 years old. So you're going to notice a lot of these evolutionary scientists or theorists, they are very leery and scared, especially, 1800s. They were scared to go against what the Bible says because, and a lot of these people came from Europe somewhere. In Europe, if you went against the church and basically said, "Oh, the Bible's wrong," then you might have been tarred and feathered at that point in time. So they were very careful, and so a lot of them, may wait to say things. So if you look at his lifetime, he would have been pretty old. He would have been in 1778, and he was born in 1707. So he would have been 61-ish, and in that time period, that was pretty old. So I guess maybe he didn't care if something happened to him at that point because he was already old or what. But anyway, it was a lot of fear involved in going anything, that was against religion and the Bible. So Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin, Erasmus Darwin are the only cases you really have to focus on first name. So Erasmus Darwin was Charles Darwin's grandfather. And so Charles Darwin's grandfather, he kind of talked about evolution too. So he talked about it, but he didn't do all the research that Charles Darwin did. And again, this is in the 1700s, but you can see how, because Erasmus Darwin was kind of focused on evolution and thinking about it, he probably put some bugs in Charles Darwin's ear to set the stage for Charles Darwin to do his own research. So anyway, Erasmus Darwin, he discussed different concepts. So one of those was common descent. That means you have the same descendants. So, we talked about common ancestor. Ancestors are the people that came before you. Descendants are people that come after you. Artificial selection by humans. So this is humans picking certain traits to mate. So if you have this tomato plant that makes the best tomatoes, that's going to help make you the most money, then I'm going to reproduce that plant instead of the plant that's not doing so hot. That will be artificial selection. Vestigial organs, we're going to talk about each one of these things, but vestigial organs are basically organs that don't do anything. And the influence of competition and sexual selection on changes in a species. So how different species compete for mates, which causes them to choose traits. They will choose a mate, a sexual partner. It's called sexual selection. So they'll choose a mate that has the traits that they particularly like. And again, this is all species. This is not just humans. So anyway, he talked about this in his work called Zoonomia. So that brings us to Lamarck. So John Baptiste Lamarck, again, he lived in the 1700s to the 1800s. So Lamarck was the first person to actually propose how there was a gradual change of species. So evolution, by definition, is a change of a species throughout a measure of time. So he's the first person to say how the species might have changed. He extended the basic definition of evolution and change over time, and he said that life must have started out very simple, like a single-celled organism, and became more and more complex over time to get our many multicellular organisms we have today. So, he wrote the Philosophie Zoologique. I told you I can't say all this stuff. He in that writing, he described what he believed was a two-part mechanism. How change was introduced gradually, and then passed on from generation to generation. One of his things was the theory of transformation, or simply Lamarckism. Okay, so what you're seeing there should say Lamarckism. So one of the things that Lamarck is known to have discussed is giraffes. So if you look in the fossil record, you'll see that giraffes have not always had only long necks. They had short, medium, and long necks in the fossil record. And then over time, you can see that the short and the medium neck giraffes were not present in the fossil record, and now all we have is long neck giraffes. So Lamarck's reasoning for this was that it was something that he called the law of use and disuse. He said if you use a body part more often, then you're going to see that use show up more in the population. And he also talked about inheritance of acquired traits. So anyway, back to law of use and disuse. That would be your giraffes down here. So he said that because the giraffes had to stretch their necks, and they used that stretching, that over time their necks became progressively longer in the fossil record. Well, we know today now that what actually happened was the short-necked giraffes couldn't reach the food, so they died. They starved to death. And then the medium-necked giraffes couldn't reach the food, and they died. They starved to death. The long-necked giraffes were able to reach the food so that they could eat, so that they survived. Because the long-necked giraffes survived, that's who got to reproduce. So their genes got passed on until eventually you had many more long-necked genes, and so much so that the short and medium necks just kind of died out. They fizzled out. And that is natural selection. That's survival of the fittest. The fittest was the longer necked giraffes. But Lamarck was before Darwin's time. And he thought this was called the law of use and disuse, which we know is actually not true. He also talked about inheritance of acquired traits. So an acquired trait would be a trait you get during your lifetime. For example, if I chop my leg off in a lawnmower accident, okay, he thought that all your children would be missing a leg, because that would be like a trait you acquired in your lifetime. So anyway, we know both of these are not actually true. Okay, so that brings us to Darwin. So Darwin, I like to call Darwin Big Daddy because he is the guy who really did most of the major, I guess, research you would call it, on the basic concepts of evolution that we know to be true. There's lots of concepts when we talk about evolution. And most of evolution, many scientists agree on. And what Darwin researched You can easily agree with it and see. But he did take some of his research and he kind of extended what the research actually showed. And when we get into the origin of life, creation, that's where a lot of scientists disagree on. Of course, we have different religions that have different theories on creation. And then we have different scientists that have different theories on creation. And so, as you know, you've probably heard, of several of these. But anyway, so nobody has a time machine for us to go back and see how things evolved. So there's no way we could really prove it. But what we can do is we can observe natural selection, in species populations. So we can observe some things, some parts of evolution, but there's other parts that we'll probably never be able to observe, like creation. So anyway, Darwin lived in the 1800s. He is the father of evolution. And because of that, his research was so great that he's still, to this day, considered having some of the best research on natural selection. Anyway, so this is what he did. So in 1831, he got on a boat and they went on a 5-year voyage. On this voyage, he stopped at different places. And he picked up a lot of different species, some specimens, different things, plants, animals, and he made all these observations, wrote all this stuff down about each species, different traits, genetic traits that he noticed, traits that they had in common, traits that were different. Anyway, so he spent a large amount of his 5-year voyage in the Galapagos Islands, and these islands are very famous because of Darwin's research. Anyway, he did research several different species on the Galapagos Islands, but the most known species was a species of bird called finches. So anyway, just a little bit about the geography. You can think of the Galapagos Islands kind of like our barrier islands. Off the coast of Mississippi, we have barrier islands. And so the Galapagos Islands were similar to that, but they are a little further out than what our barrier islands would be. They're far enough to where it would be, a difficult trip for like a bird to make from the mainland, whereas our islands are much closer. Anyway, so he thought that you had all these finches, these birds, and you have all these islands, and he felt like they migrated from the mainland, and then they went to each island. So if they did that, then he thought they should be exactly the same as the birds on the mainland. If the birds had been originally made for that island, then they would all be just totally different. But what he noticed was that the birds were very similar, and he noticed the key differences were in like their beak structure, and he attributed all of their differences based on the food sources that were available at each particular island that they were on. Okay, so this is Darwin's journey. So if you see, let me zoom out. That was a picture of Darwin when he was old. So if you look here, he basically went pretty much around the world. So he left Europe, and he went down, all the way down the Atlantic Ocean. You see the red arrow there. And he made several different stops. But anyway, so one of his big stops was the Galapagos Islands, and then he went back around again. Anyway, some of his stops, of course, would have been, to get supplies or food and things like that. But anyway, so if you look, you have a picture up top of a close-up of the Galapagos Islands. And if you look in the picture of the whole world, the Galapagos Islands are pretty far off from the mainland. So too far for a bird to fly, pretty much. Okay, so anyway, like I said, Darwin thought, okay, well, all these birds should be the same as the mainland, which, would have been South America. So he said all the birds should be the same as the mainland. But then what he noticed was that they were actually very similar. They were not the same, very similar. And like I said, their key differences were based on the environment of the particular island that they were on. So he noticed that the birds evolved from the mainland birds to survive whatever the environmental condition on that island was. So anyway, he also, here's a picture of a finch, but he also studied some of the tortoises too, and if you look, they had different shells and their necks were different lengths and things like that. But anyway, so Darwin realized that most of the differences with the finches were based on, he attributed it to each particular island environment. And so he said they must have adapted to their environment, and those that did not adapt, they died. Okay, so the only ones that were able to survive on island 1 would be the ones that, were adapted to that island. The only ones that would be able to survive on island 2 would be the birds that were adapted to that island, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so again, this was the 1800s. So he went on the voyage 5 years. He actually spent 5 years writing his book. On the Origin of Species was the name of his book. And anyway, he waited 5 years to publish his ideas because they, caused some controversy, of course, like I said before, with religion, because he did get into not only natural selection, but how that would relate back to creation. So his book, this is what his book said. So his book said that all populations show the ability to change from one generation to the next. Okay, so I'm not sure if you recall, but a population, okay, is going to be one species, plant, animal, whatever, one species in one place at one particular time. Okay, so for example, the bullfrogs in Van Cleve, Mississippi in August of 2004, for example. So anyway, all populations show the ability to change from one generation to the next. So he was just saying that you can change, your species can change. He also said that competition and genetic variation led to natural selection. So again, we talked about the giraffes earlier. If I have a giraffe, or I have these short, medium, and long neck giraffes, that is genetic variation. Okay, they're genetically different. That is what, they have a short neck, medium neck, long neck. Well, now they're going to compete. They're either going to compete for food or water, possibly mates. But anyway, so because of their genetic variation, they're not all the same. They compete for resources. So that competition and those genetic differences leads to natural selection. Again, natural selection is also known as survival of the fittest in layman's terms. So it's basically when nature selects, okay, so nature selects which traits are best going to survive, okay? And if you survive, you get to reproduce. If you're dead, you're not reproducing, okay? So basically, your choices are adapt or die, pretty much. I mean, I know that's very blunt, but, mostly we're talking about animals, but they either are going to adapt to their environment or die. So humans have so much genetic variation. This has allowed us to adapt very well to many different environments. Most organisms, most populations cannot survive in varying environments. Okay, so for example, mosquitoes, bugs, any kind of insects, they're not going to survive in environments that, are freezing for large portions of the year. Snakes, you're not going to have snakes in certain parts of the world like we do here in Mississippi. So, anyway, so you're going to have a lot of very specific organisms that live in very specific places. A penguin, is not going to survive in Mississippi very well, just out in the wild, because they are not accustomed to this kind of environment. It's very different from the environment that they, naturally live in. So anyway, the more variation the species has, the more likely they can survive a bunch of different climates and scenarios. So, this is another reason why genetic variation is good and favorable, because the more genetic variation you have, the easier it is for you to have someone who can survive. Anyway, so like I said, nature selects who is best fit for the environment. Now, because of this, many species have become extinct. Okay, so a lot of people believe that, the dinosaurs became extinct because they did not adapt. We know that dinosaurs were cold-blooded. So there's one of the theories is an ice age. So they didn't adapt to the cold conditions. They were not accustomed to that. They died. So anyway, that's just one of the theories. We don't really actually know for sure. Anyway. Another thing that natural selection led to was vestigial structures. Okay, so structures that you had, if you look back, they would have been used at some point in the evolutionary history of that species, but now they don't need it anymore. So that would be like the appendix in humans. It's thought that the appendix was basically a longer digestive system for you to be able to digest like plants better, because like rabbits use their appendix, but now we don't really need it so much because we don't eat. I mean, we eat plants, animals, we kind of everything. We're omnivores. Anyway, and also another thing that natural selection leads to is new species being formed. So as the species steadily changes over time, the species gradually becomes different and modified. So you get more and more differences gradually over time, and eventually it becomes so different from the original species that you get a new species formed. We're going to talk about that later on. That's called speciation. Another thing that it is an example of is descent with modification. So modification is change. Okay, so modification is a change. Okay, descent, we talked about that your descendants are the people that come after you. Okay, so descent with modification is changes in descendants. So anyway, all these things Darwin talked about, and we can see a lot of these things, if we look in the fossil record and we look at, how things play out in the wild. And we've talked before that fruit flies, for example, have a very short life cycle. So we can see generation to generation, many generations in one of our human lifespans, for example. So anyway, a lot of people agree with all these things. But where you get to where people are not necessarily agreeing with Darwin is where he concluded that all living things had a common ancestor. Okay, so basically he concluded that all living things came from one ancestor and evolved over time and became more and more and more different species. New species kept forming. So that's how you got all the different species there are today or that have been. So basically he's saying that life began from a single cell, a common ancestor. Okay, so that's where a lot of people don't necessarily agree with him, and that conflicts with a lot of religions and things. So here is a great image of the Galapagos finches. Okay, so we have their name for you, and then their food source, what their adaptation is for feeding, and the habitat they like to live in. Okay, so each one of these finches came from a different island. Okay, and so if you'll notice, they have some similarities. Some of them are similar in their coloring. If you look at their eyes, you'll notice a lot of similarities there. Of course, there were some similarities in their bodies. But anyway, if you look at their head, they weren't exactly the same, but he could tell, okay, they were maybe from the same family type thing. So what he noticed was, like, let's say these finches, okay, they eat cacti, right? They eat cactuses, and they live in the ground. Well, maybe there wasn't trees for them to get in, okay? And so these that live in the trees would have died out if they went to the cactus island. Okay, these would have died out if they lived, they eat insects. There was no insects on the cactus island, okay, and no trees. So they would have died because they would have had no shelter and no food, if that makes sense. So this particular finch was adapted to that particular island. And if you had all these other variations that showed up, then they would not have survived those particular conditions. So if you look at this particular beak here, notice it's a kind of longer beak because you wouldn't want the cactus to poke you in the eye. And anyway, it's also crushing, for them to crush their food source. Seeds include like nuts, like walnuts and things like that. Okay, so this one had a pointed crushing beak. This one had just a larger crushing beak. So maybe this guy had walnuts to eat, and this guy couldn't fit a walnut in his mouth at all, and he had nothing to eat, so he died. So all the other ones would have died out if they were to go to that island. So that's how survival of the fittest, and how Darwin's research went. So here's a few other pictures just showing some evolutionary concepts. So if you look here, we have our original bird here, which is a orange variation, and we had a yellow one kind of branch off, and this orange got darker and darker and eventually became red. So this is showing how one bird can eventually become two different species as it gets more and more changes. In insects, insecticide is basically bug spray. Okay, so if you spray all these bugs with bug spray, eventually there's going to be a bug that does not die from the bug spray. Well, guess what? He didn't die, so he's going to reproduce. Okay, and so when he reproduces, all the baby bugs are all going to be immune to the bug spray too. Okay, so this is survival of the fittest, natural selection. Okay, this also can happen in bacteria too. If you have all these bacteria up here and you have one survive the antibiotic that you're given, well, now you're going to have a whole bunch of bacteria, because bacteria reproduce faster than bugs do. You recall 1,000,000 in 7 hours, some species, so that's how you get antibiotic resistant bacteria. So here are some other concepts that Darwin looked at. So if you take a look here, we've got some pictures of some embryos. That's up top here. So embryo is the first 8 weeks of development for humans. So if you take a look here at the human on this side, it does have some similarities. It is going to be most similar to the cat and the chicken and the turtle compared to the lamprey. Okay, so you can see the pharyngeal slits. The pharynx is the throat, by the way, and you can see the vertebrae, the kind of curled in shape. Anyway, so they have some similarities. And then you have the picture of all these birds with all these different beaks. Their beaks are different based on primarily what their food source is. So, as you notice, this guy here kind of has a scary looking beak. He probably drinks the nectar out of flowers. Whereas this guy, he probably eats like nuts or seeds. Okay, so more scientists. I told you there's going to be a lot of scientists. Okay, so Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus is a very important fellow, okay, for a couple of reasons. But anyway, he lived kind of same time period as Darwin, a little bit older, 1700s to 1800s. Anyway, he's the one who talked about carrying capacity and limiting factors. Okay, so we're going to talk about both of these concepts more in our last unit, our next unit, which is ecology, but we're going to introduce it here when we talk about Malthus. So Thomas Malthus, he said that there were factors that limit the population's size. Okay, so that would be like food, water, possibly mates, possibly habitat, space to live. He said that populations tend to grow exponentially, but natural resources do not grow exponentially. They grow like arithmetically. Maybe they don't even grow. And once the population reaches a certain amount, if they don't have enough of those resources, then it reaches carrying capacity. At which point, if you reach carrying capacity, things are going to start dying. They're going to die from starvation or lack of water or habitat. So anyway, at the bottom here, what it should say is examples of limiting factors, which is going to be like food, water. Food and water, of course, are going to be the main ones. Habitat, space. Habitat, space, kind of the same thing. But anyway, so limiting factors are going to be those things. So if I only have food for 10 people, well, 10 people is all that's going to survive in that area. So this is Malthus, just showing that a population grows much faster than the resources grow. So anyway, Lyell. Lyell was another famous scientist. So Lyell was basically a geologist. And so he said that the catastrophism theory was wrong. He basically believed that the earth has continuously changed. And because the earth has continuously changed, again, he was a geologist, he said that then plants and animals and species must continually change too. So he wrote the Principles of Geology, and he talked about the earth must be very, very old, and he talked about how the earth has been shaped by different processes like erosion, earthquakes, glaciers moving, volcanoes, and then like decomposition of plants and animals, of course, that make like oil and gas and stuff. So here's a picture of Lyell, and then here's a picture of the geology processes that he was saying shaped the earth. Okay, so biogeography. So bio is life. Geo usually refers to like rocks. And then graphy refers to like maps and things. So biogeography is actually the study of how living things are spread out over like a map. So biogeography is going to be one of those things that provides some evidence towards evolution. So, basically, if you look at a map, then you would see that, for example, polar bears only live in certain places. Monkeys only live in certain places. Elephants only live in certain places. Okay, they're distributed in certain places. Okay, so that's biogeography. So this does provide some evidence for evolution, and it's also evidence towards how you have common descendants. So then you have molecular biology. We've actually studied molecular biology some. This studies your macromolecules. Okay, so that's going to be like your macromolecules, remember, are going to be your carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Okay, so primarily this is going to be studying your nucleic acids and proteins. And we know protein synthesis is very closely linked to your DNA and RNA. So it's going to be studying genes and mutations and those biomolecules that we've done that previous unit on. So another guy that contributed to Darwin is Wallace. So we talked about biogeography because Wallace is the father of biogeography. And because of this, he came to the same conclusion as Darwin, that species changed over time because of their struggle for existence, because of survival of the fittest. He realized that only certain things could live in certain areas or else they died. And so he kind of understood natural selection in that way. The reason why Wallace is the father of biogeography and not the father of evolution is because Wallace just wrote an essay on his thoughts. He didn't actually have like concrete research. Darwin did years of research, so he had like legit examples in this species and that species and this island and that island. And so Darwin had a lot of evidence to support his findings. Whereas Wallace just maybe had thoughts. So anyway, remember how I said Darwin waited 5 years to publish once he finished his book? Well, the motivator for Darwin to publish his book was after he read Wallace's essay. So Darwin had spent years of his life researching these concepts, and writing his thoughts in his book, and analyzing all the data that he came up with. But he was scared to publish it. He was scared of backlash. Again, this was the 1800s. And so Darwin read Wallace's essay, and he's like, all right, well, I mean, I can't let him take credit for these thoughts. I got to put out my research, which is way better than just his thoughts. I mean, I'm guessing that's what he thought. But anyway, so after Wallace, submitted his essay and Darwin read it, he was like, oh snap, let me publish my book, which is way better than this guy's essay. And so there we have it. Darwin is the father of evolution because he had the actual research to back up his thoughts. He wrote a book, whereas Wallace wrote an essay. And Wallace is the father of biogeography. So, neo-Darwinism. So again, we're talking about hundreds of years ago. All the scientists we've talked about. So that brings us to neo-Darwinism. So we have Darwin's original theory, which is still, widely accepted. But if you recall, when we went over genetics, we talked about the father of genetics, Mendel. So Darwin's research came before Mendel's research. And so because of that, Darwin's original theory and book did not actually include any genetic information. He had all these thoughts about these variation that he noticed, but he didn't correlate it to genetics. Well, now we've had Mendel's research and we understand genetics better after Darwin's original research and theory, was proposed. We can actually combine the idea of genetics and evolution to see how they're linked, how the actual genes do not get passed on if you die, and how with genetics we understand how genes get passed on, how sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, because of sex cells being haploid. Anyway, so neo-Darwinism is the modification of Darwin's original theory to include Mendel's genetic research. So there is some more current research on evolution. So again, people are important. So Kirshner and Gerhardt, they proposed a new theory called facilitated variation. So that explains or attempts to explain how animals generate changes in their physical appearance from genetic changes. So they think that small changes in very core processes have caused large-scale changes in different organisms. So they think very minute changes that the organism has made have caused huge changes in the actual organism. So, animals can generate changes in their physical appearance, which then can result in genetic changes. That's kind of what it's saying.